Hi, my name is Michael Kang, and along with Lynn Bresnahan, David Carnell, Chitrasha Gupta, we're here to bring you a presentation on international organizations, what their current and future impact relevancies are. We'll be going through four international organizations, starting off with the United Nations, followed by the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank.
Is an intergovernmental organization that aims to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve the international cooperation. It acts as a center for harmonizing actions of the nations to benefit for the world at large. United Nations was established in 1945 after the Second World War to prevent the future wars and maintain the international peace and security, establish the human rights, and promoting the sustainable economic development of a lot of developing countries. Starting with 50 countries in 1945, currently it is made up of 193 member states. In order to carry out its objectives, it has six organs that participate in various initiatives of the organization. US is the largest donor to the United Nations, contributing to approximately 10 billion in 2018. This is almost one fifth of the total amount that the US spends annually on the foreign aid. With the funding that the United Nations receives from its member countries, it allocates to various agencies under the UN umbrella. These agencies have done some impressive work over the years. Among the various initiatives, the few notable ones that are worth mentioning are number one, food providing the food for 90 million people for over 75 countries. The second, assist 34 million refugees and authorizes 71 million peacekeeping missions. UN is also a big supplier of the vaccines for us to the world's children, which saves about 3 million lives in a year. Over the years, the role of United Nations has expanded from peacekeepers to providing the solutions to the global issues. Like any other organizations, they have faced criticisms for not being effective in promoting globalization, providing controversial healthcare options, or being too bureaucratic and giving few countries more power than the other. Some of the well known failures, or I would say the areas where they have not done enough, are number one, crisis in South Sudan, where the UN peacekeeping mission which was established in 2011, was unsuccessful in protecting the civilians from the death and torture. Second notable one is cholera in Haiti, when after 2010 earthquake, the UN-led Nepali aid workers were blamed for spreading cholera throughout the country of Haiti. More than thousands of people were actually died from this outbreak. The third one is the Oil of the Food Program. This initiative was designed to allow Iraq to sell oil through the UN in exchange for food and medicine. But the accusations surfaced that much of the money was actually funneled into the UN government and to the UN officials. On analyzing these failures, it appears that the problem are multiple. The first one being like the veto power. The five member states of the UN have used their veto power repeatedly to indulge into activities to benefit themselves and their allies without totally taking into account the world peace. The second being the lack of funds. Many UN members have failed to deposit the fixed funds that they have committed to. Now, this brings a lot of financial stress to UN in its peacekeeping missions that it wants to undergo. The third is the outdated organization structure. The bureaucratic structure results in a lot of efficiencies and the lack of coordination between each group within the organization. Then there's the terrorism and refugee. The UN has miserably failed to counter terrorism in the world. Terrorism, as we all know, have caused millions of deaths of innocent lives. There is also a significant number of increase in the number of refugees. UN plays a major role in providing the healthcare and education, food, setting up the camps for these refugees, but there are still millions who are deprived of the basic needs. Even if they have been unsuccessful in many initiatives, UN has been able to manage and transform a major conflict into a minor one through its peacekeeping missions and activities. But again, they could have done much more with the kind of resources that they have at their disposal. The ongoing efforts for the sustainability have achieved few milestones over the years, but a lot needs to be done. The goal for 2030 specifies the specific 17 global issues that UN plans to work on in the next 10 years time span. Few notable ones are climate action, reducing inequalities, gender equality, peace, justice, and strong institutions. To be able to maintain its original purpose and be an effective arm of the international organization and to serve the people for the world at large, there are few things that they might be useful for them to undergo. First is structural change. Now, that will help to minimize the veto power of the five permanent countries who are too biased in their decisions and which are in their own benefit. Two is identifying the ways to repair the peacekeeping missions so that they can better protect the civilians. Third is consistent persuasion to the countries to reduce their carbon emission and help those affected by the consequences of these climate changes. Identify the ways to manage the new reality of mass migration. As Margaret Huang, the executive director of human rights organization, once quoted, the UN is like your conscience. It can't make you do the right thing, but will definitely help you take the right decision. I hope UN is able to live up to its original purpose and peacekeeping and find its way to end the scourge of war. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lynn Bresnahan, and I'm going to be talking about the World Health Organization. The WHO was founded in 1948 after World War II, just like the UN, and is actually a sub-organization of the UN. But work really didn't begin until 1951, after it's got an infusion of resources and capital that it needed. The mission of the WHO is the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health, and this includes a broad mandate of activities, including promoting human health and well-being, collecting data on global health issues and managing those statistics, conducting research and monitoring public health risks, setting international health standards and guidelines, providing technical assistance to member countries, especially those in the developing world that don't have strong internal health systems, coordinating responses to health emergencies, like the one we're experiencing right now with COVID-19. And in recent decades, it's added even more initiatives to its focus, which would be focusing on women's and children's health, nutrition, sanitation, and fighting malaria and tuberculosis. Additionally, it publishes the World Health Report to provide policymakers and international organizations the information they need to make competent health policy. Its governance starts with the World Health Assembly. This is the decision-making body that's composed of representatives from all 194 member states. It meets yearly in Geneva in May, and it determines the policy and budget of the WHO. Every 5 years, it elects a director general, and then every 3 years, it elects 34 members qualified in the field of health to its executive board. And that executive board really has the responsibility for carrying out the decision and policies of the assembly and really facilitate the nitty-gritty of the work of the WHO. Additionally, it has regional offices with individual regional committees. These were created in 1949 and through 1952 to address the specific needs of each region. They are made of the member states in the region. They elect the regional committee. The regional committee elects a regional director, and then the executive board of the WHO has to approve that regional director. But since 2004, it has not rejected a candidate. So you can see there are multiple layers of governance to the WHO and dispersed decision making. So it can be hard at times once the WHO sets priority for things to actually get carried out at the country or even local community level. Next, I'm going to discuss funding. There are two sources of funding from member states and private donors. First is the assessed contributions of member states. This is based on a formula which includes GDP per capita and is only 20% of the WHO budget. Next are voluntary contributions, and that's 80% of the WHO budget. But 96% of those voluntary contributions are earmarked for specific projects. This has grown out of the 80s and 90s when donors started to lose faith in the organization and management of the WHO, so they did not believe the WHO could determine its own priorities. So they started earmarking it for projects that were more like their pet projects. And this has caused quite a bit of problem for the WHO because they have a huge portion of their budget that is not, that they can't count on year on year, as well as even though the WHO, the World Health Assembly, may set its priorities, if they don't have funds for that because they're earmarked for other projects, then they can't actually execute on those initiatives. And to give you some context, the US provides 15% of the WHO budget. You may have heard about that in the news lately. And the US CDC in 2020 had a budget of $6.6 billion compared to the WHO has a budget of $5.84 billion for 2 years. So you have an organization that is trying to work on the world level, on a global scale, improving the health of human beings, and it has about half the budget to work with in a year that the US CDC has. Some successes of the WHO are childhood vaccination. We eradicated smallpox in 1977 and nearly eradicated polio. It was once predicted to happen in 2010, but there have been setbacks lately in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there are some concerns that it will spread back to countries like India that have been declared polio-free. But unfortunately, this has taken a bit of a backstage to the COVID-19 crisis, given that it's the more acute crisis right now. It was seen as positively leading during the SARS epidemic of 2003. And its focus on community-based solutions versus hospital-based healthcare has led to a redesign of health systems in the developed and developing nations that has been seen as a great success for the WHO. Unfortunately, there's quite a bit of criticism of the WHO. It started with the AIDS response. Unfortunately, that response was seen as so poor on the behalf of the WHO that the UN set up its own UN AIDS organization to tackle that epidemic. At this point was also when donors started to lose faith in the WHO's ability to govern itself. And that's when you start to see the earmarked voluntary contributions start to increase. In 2014, unfortunately, it was seen as slow and disorganized and lacking leadership in its response to the Ebola epidemic. The Africa regional office is seen as the weakest and most politicized. Unfortunately, the appointments are typically made on a political basis versus a technocratic basis. And the UN ended up setting up an independent Ebola mission to respond to that crisis, as well as the US CDC sent resources to aid the local response. Which brings us to the current COVID-19 crisis. You may have heard in the news that the WHO's response to COVID-19 has become highly politicized between China and the US. This comes from the WHO's praise of China's early response when early warnings were silenced by local government. This criticism has led President Donald Trump to potentially pull US's funding from the WHO, which would further exacerbate the WHO's funding issues. Also, criticisms have come that expert advice has not kept up with the rapid pace of change of information. Up until about a week ago, the WHO was still only recommending hand washing and social distancing as a way to keep COVID-19 from spreading, when there was mounting evidence that wearing masks in public would also be helpful, and recently just reversed course and said that yes, in addition, we need to be wearing masks in public. And really has been seen with the COVID-19 crisis as reactionary instead of leading the way you would expect from a global health organization. So what is the path forward for the WHO? The WHO met in May, virtually, unfortunately this time for the first time, due to COVID-19, and it ended with a resolution for independent and comprehensive evaluation of global response, including but not limited to the WHO's performance. I feel like this is a great time for the WHO to look inward, to look at what it needs to do and change so that it can maintain relevance moving forward on the world stage. And this process could be used to create a roadmap for meaningful long-term change. They need to work on how their budget is structured and try to move more of its budgeting to assessed dues versus voluntary contributions. like I have discussed, those voluntary contributions are earmarked, as well as they rise and fall with the economy, which could happen again during this crisis. As well as it does its budget on a 2-year basis. If it does it on a 5 or 10-year basis, maybe it wouldn't be as subject to fads and donor initiatives. It needs to reform its bureaucratic structure, and it needs to work on attracting top talent so that it can make the best policy possible, including expertise from law, economics, and social sciences. It needs the commitment from global powers to re-engage, support, and finance WHO priorities instead of turning it into a political tool. And lastly, it needs to increase transparency, efficiency, and management. All of this should restore credibility as a preeminent World Health Authority, policymaker, and response coordinator. Thank you.
Okay, up next is the World Trade Organization. So what is the WTO? It was formed in 1995 to regulate international trade, including goods, services, and intellectual property. It provides framework for trade agreements and dispute resolution. It superseded the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that was established after World War II as a result of growing globalization and the need to reform GATT agreements. And it currently includes 164 members. So a brief history on the WTO. The GATT was formed after World War II, and within the GATT, there were 7 rounds of negotiations that took place to establish international trade agreements from 1949 to 1979. Although it did face some issues and some headwinds where not all members agreed to accept all agreements. So some of these challenges included structural deficiencies and impacts of certain countries' policies on world trade. And then ultimately in the 1980s, it led to its final, which was its 8th round of negotiations, the Uruguay round, which was its largest reform in trade of services, intellectual property, agriculture, and textiles. And ultimately the WTO was formed out of this last round of negotiations. And that was in 1995. So impacts or influences that the WTO has on global trade are really based around its principles, which include non-discrimination, reciprocity, binding and enforceable commitments, transparency, and safety values. Another key aspect of the WTO is that the size and power of its members do not directly result in increased influence on the agreements. However, there's indirect influences that these members can place on the agreements, and that can be either through not agreeing to various agreements, considering the agreements do require all members to agree before they're put into place, or they could issue appeals against agreements, which could cause some challenges keeping those agreements in place. Also, accession into the WTO involves a very thorough and lengthy process, where again, the new member does need to agree to all current agreements within the WTO, so they'll either have to make some concessions and commitments to those agreements before they become a member. So the current state of the WTO is that they've had a very successful history at reducing trade barriers and has accelerated economic growth, reduced poverty, and increased wealth. At least as of 2007, its members represented 96.4% of global trade and 96.7% of GDP. So generally, almost all global trade that happens is done under the WTO and its rules and regulations. Also, accession in the WTO has increased trade between members by 171% and trade between members and non-members by around 88%. So the WTO has done a very successful job at facilitating international trade and really driving economic growth. You'll see in the chart on the top right there in green, those are all the members of the WTO. In yellow, those are pending applicants into the WTO. However, as we've researched, that the WTO is not always consistent in the performance of its members. It's only increased trade by 32% for developing countries, as opposed to 65% for developed countries. So we'll see a few more issues here on the next slides. Some of the additional byproducts and criticism of the WTO's success are around economic inequality, which has increased within member states. Also, members have recently questioned its ability to resolve disputes. For example, late last year, the US has attempted to block new appointments of judges, which has ultimately brought the entire dispute settlement system to a halt. And this was really rooted in the US's displeasement with how the dispute process was going. And so they had this indirect influence in holding up new appointments of judges. Also, a big one here, the Doha round of agreements in 2015, which is currently not concluded with any agreement, where it attempted to lower trade barriers and subsidies in farming to help developing countries. Since it has not come to an agreement, and actually original discussions started in 1997 that you'll see here on the right, it's kind of undermined the WTO's credibility at resolving some of these agreements. Considering this round has taken so long, confidence in the WTO's ability to facilitate these agreements has really caused some challenges. Also, certain countries are starting to go around the WTO rules by issuing tariffs outside of the guidelines. This is a big thing with the trade war between the US and China. Also, the length of time for disputes has been a challenge. This is, again, one of the US's main concerns, that the length of time in the process for dispute resolution has been quite challenging. Ultimately, the US has even, under the Trump administration, threatened to leave the WTO. So ultimately, our main takeaway or prediction for the WTO and its influence on the global trade moving forward is that it has had a very good and successful history at facilitating global trade, increasing economic growth between countries and within countries. However, we are expecting to see some headwinds with the WTO's influence on global trade, and that is really due to kind of an indirect influence that the current global kind of trade or economy is seeing, and that's kind of influenced by political and other economic issues, resulting in around the retreat of democracy, rise in political separatism, rise in populist movements, slowdown in globalization. So some of those areas will kind of have an indirect influence on trade in general, and also the WTO's ability to facilitate world trade. So with these headwinds, our recommendation, at least for the WTO, to help maintain its success, is really it needs to be a more active role in meeting the needs in the current environment. And this can be done by driving agreements to closure and arbitrating trade wars or disagreements, and really driving the dispute process to be more efficient. And these two things will help kind of reestablish its positive momentum that it's had in the past. But this is obviously up for debate. I'm interested in seeing what other people's thoughts are.
All right, our last topic for today will be the World Bank, and we're going to go into who they are, what they do, and what their goals are. So to understand the World Bank, we'll take a step back to understand what the World Bank Group is. The World Bank Group is a cooperative made up of 189 member countries, including the US, China, and many EU countries. They're comprised of 5 institutions that are the 5 pillars that come together to make the World Bank Group, and each group or each institution has their own members and regulations and their own purpose for their contributions to the World Bank Group. But their combined goal, all 5 of them, is to reduce global extreme poverty to 3% by 2030. And we'll touch on exactly what global extreme poverty means a little later. The World Bank is a subset of the World Bank Group. So the IBRD and the IDA come together to form what's known as the World Bank, and they provide the financing policy advice and technical assistance to governments of developing countries. And then the other three, IFC, MIGA, ICSID, all focus on strengthening the private sector in developing countries. So for instance, the IFC is focused on the private sector in developing countries to help create markets that address the biggest development challenges there. The MIGA promotes cross-border investment in developing countries by providing guarantees, which are political risk insurance and credit enhancement to investors and lenders. Their guarantees protect investments against non-commercial risks and helps investors obtain access to funding sources with improved financial terms and conditions. And the ICSID is very straightforward. They help settle international investment disputes, and the five of these together come to form the World Bank Group. Now, what we'll go ahead and do is kind of discuss how the World Bank, which is a subset of the World Bank Group, came together, and that began with the Bretton Woods system. That was established as an international monetary system, financial regulations between the US, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, and Japan after the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. So these countries came together in the United States in Bretton Woods, I believe it was in New Jersey, and each country agreed to maintain exchange rates within 1% of gold. And the price of gold at 1 ounce was set to $35 US, and at the $35, the US was responsible for maintaining the US dollar per ounce of gold by adjusting the supply of the US dollar. The accords that came out of the Bretton Woods Agreement established the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the IBRD we just mentioned. The goal was to increase globalization, trade, with a unified approach to monetary management, and in conjunction with the IMF, to finance temporary loans, balance of payments across all participating nations. So this was meant to help curb inflation and the volatility or unpredictability of currencies worldwide. However, this system didn't last too long. It lasted just under 30 years. When Nixon converted the US dollar from a gold standard to the fiat currency in 1971. And he did that because some say it was a political move for him to, he wanted to address the high unemployment rate, and he saw this as a way to bring unemployment back. So there's some theories. He found himself as the protector of the dollar and wanted to bring more control back into the United States, essentially, or bring to the United States to help with the inflation and elevated interest rates here in the United States. So questions to ponder with that move is, why did the U.S. take the responsibility for maintaining the U.S. dollar versus gold value? We think during the World War II, this was in the World War II era, we're thinking maybe it's along the lines of the U.S.'s stance on being world police, and that was very strong during that time frame. And was it a good decision to end the Bretton Woods system that was intended to bring global financial stability? That's an arguable point. The biggest difference I see is that it transitioned us from a gold-based economy to a fiat currency system, which bases itself on the government stating that it's a good currency. So these are some questions. Those are what I think, not necessarily what the whole group thinks, but these questions, let's chat about it in the forum to come after this video. The World Bank, the IBRD, was established with the goal of supporting European Union reconstruction post-World War II, and after that completed, the IDA was established to help developing countries with low income and credit. And then the IFC was also established to help lend to private companies, financial institutions in those developing countries. And just to give you an idea of what the World Bank's credit rating is, the S&P 500 credit rating gives them a triple A, which is, I believe, the highest rating that one organization can get. And they are very trustworthy and have very good credit score. The World Bank's path forward is interesting because the impact of the COVID-19 and our presentation was not necessarily to dig into the COVID-19 impacts globally too much, but it does have a direct impact on the World Bank and their two goals, the primary of which is being to decrease global extreme poverty to less than 3%. And the second goal is to foster income growth of bottom 40% for every country. And this chart here shows, it's hard to read, but the extreme poverty is measured at the number of people living on less than $1.90 per day, and that's how they define global extreme poverty. And COVID-19 has caused the poverty to reverse, and those are some of the projections that they're forecasting. And so to wrap this up, here are some questions to ponder regarding all four organizations that we discussed here today. Do you think countries worldwide are still in support of global organizations? Will these organizations be collateral damage to the spread of protectionism and retrenchment? And should countries still contribute as much, if not more, funds to these organizations and grow and/or support developing countries during the COVID-19 crisis, taking into consideration the resulting potential recession that's around the corner? We thank you very much for listening to what we have to say today, and we look forward to having some insightful and great discussions to follow. Thank you.